Bangladeshi police crack down on demonstrators who have paralysed the capital. With tens of thousands of people protesting, will the government listen or continue to respond with force? I'm Adnan Nawaz, and today's newsmakers are the student protests in Bangladesh. When a speeding bus hit and killed 2 students in the capital of Bangladesh 6 weeks ago, it caused outrage and brought thousands of other young students onto the streets. They've been voicing their concerns over safety on the country's roads and a lack of accountability. They've also been trying to enforce traffic rules, stopping cars, checking licenses, at one point turning back a minister whose car was driving against the flow of traffic. And as the demonstrations continue, the authorities have flexed their muscle with batons and water cannon. Haider Abbasi reports.
Driving protesters off Dhakar's streets. Bangladesh's capital has been paralysed by tens of thousands of students. But the police seem determined to stop them, even if that includes using violence.
They have beaten us with bamboos, by kicking us and in other ways. It does not matter. It won't affect me. But we want safe roads.
The protests were triggered after the deaths of 2 school children killed by a speeding bus last month. Since then, Dhaka streets have been filled with these crowds. They're demanding tougher enforcement of traffic laws. According to one research group, more than 4,200 people died in road accidents last year. The students have been stopping buses to check drivers' licenses.
We haven't been able to drive our buses as students have attacked and damaged our vehicles. We can't go on the roads. Students hit our drivers, so no vehicles can move.
Authorities say more than 300 vehicles have been damaged by the demonstrators. But now mobile internet services have been cut, and police have used tear gas and rubber bullets. At least 100 people have been wounded. Many protesters say it's not just the police who are involved in the crackdown, as they've been attacked by pro-government activists armed with sticks and machetes. The government of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina denies this. It says it will now extend prison sentences to anyone causing traffic accidents. Shahid Al-Alam is a renowned photographer in Bangladesh. Just hours after speaking to the media about the protests, he was arrested at his home in Dhaka. Police say he's being interrogated for what they call provocative comments. His family alleges he's been tortured. According to Human Rights Watch, at least 20 journalists have been beaten for reporting on the rallies. Critics say the treatment of Alam is typical of how Bangladesh deals with dissent. Reporters Without Borders says media freedom is being eroded. It ranks Bangladesh 146 out of 180 countries in its index on press freedom. Scores of journalists and bloggers have been convicted for criticizing the government and politicians. Since the ruling Awami League came to power in 2009, hundreds of opposition activists have been abducted and detained. While most have been released after weeks or even months, some have been found dead. Human Rights Watch says 86 people were disappeared last year. The election in 2014 was overshadowed by widespread violence and a boycott by the opposition. So will the student protests develop into a wider anti-government movement? And how will this impact the elections scheduled later this year? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Dhaka is Mohibul Hassan Chowdhury. He's with the Bangladeshi ruling party, the Awami League. And in Malmo in Sweden, the exiled journalist Tasneem Khalil is there for us. Tasneem has written the book Jalad, Death Squads and State Terror in South Asia. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Mohibul, let's start at the beginning. The deaths of these 2 students killed by a speeding bus, the main reason the protests began. What is the state of roads in Bangladesh?
The road safety in Bangladesh isn't anything different from what you would expect in a developing country. Bangladesh has only recently been upgraded to a developing country from what we used to be, an LDC country. So in terms of infrastructure and general road safety, traffic system, it isn't any different from what you'd expect in India, for example. So it isn't in the most most perfect order.
Would you say that the reason that the protests began was justified? Because the World Bank says that in terms of road safety, Bangladesh has one of the world's highest rates of deaths on the roads anywhere in the world.
I'm not sure about that statistics because I haven't looked into it, but it could be that Bangladesh has one of the highest rate of death in road accidents. But you'll also have to remember that we are a nation of 160 million people crammed in a delta. So in terms of numbers, it could be high. So I'm not disputing the numbers.
Okay, it's just that obviously this being the reason these protests began, Tasneem, that I'm concentrating on this for the moment, because Mohibul says he hasn't looked into it, but we certainly have. And a report last year by an international scientific journal, which is peer-reviewed and independently sourced, says that road traffic injuries are a major public health issue in Bangladesh. The government figures for the number of dead differ dramatically from other sources. For example, the World Health Organization said in a report a couple of years ago, it was looking back actually to 5 years ago, but the report only came out 3 years ago. In other words, in 2013, 17 to 25,000 people killed on the roads of Bangladesh. The government number for the same year was just over 3,000. That is a big discrepancy. Is the government trying to hide something?
What is clear here is that we have two versions of the same story. One is closer to the truth, and another party presenting this are being very economical with the truth. Let me just tell you that for the past few days, we have seen thousands and thousands of school children coming out on the streets of Dhaka, Chittagong, Rajshahi, Sylhet, and saying that this is enough. We do not want to die. We do not want to die when we are going to school, when we do not want to die when we are coming back in the afternoon, in the evening. We do not want to see our cousins die. We do not want to see our friends die like this, and this is dire. And this, let me remind you, that is unprecedented. If the situation was not so dire, the children would not have come out on the street and protested like this. And let me add to that, that in any developed or developing nation, when the citizens raise their voices demanding safety, demanding security, it is the job of the government, it is the job of the administration to provide that. Instead, we have seen that the government in Bangladesh has resorted to using
I think we have
force.
jumped into another issue here.
No, excuse me, sir. When I am speaking here, please, I'm not some school kid in Dhaka that you can bully. Please let me finish. What is happening?
Mohibul, I think Tasneem's got a point. We will definitely let you have your say.
So what we have seen, that this is a government which prefers to rule by brute force. It is not even sparing school children. This is a government that looks at everyone as its enemy. It has looked at everyone as its enemy. School children are not being spared now. So this is absolutely unfortunate, and this is absolutely unacceptable, what we are seeing right now in Bangladesh. The government is engaged in a war against its school students, against its university students. Even earlier today, there was a raid in an engineering university where students have been blooded. And this is not acceptable in any developing or developed nation.
Okay. Over to you, Mohibul.
Right. First of all, Mr. Tasneem used to be known as an anarchist during the time of the military government here, and I don't call him a journalist in exile. I call him someone who is in self-imposed exile. There is nothing pending against him, and when the protest started, and we do agree that there is a problem in Bangladesh with regards to road safety. Mr. Tasneem brings in government force, brutality, and all this. what we have to remember here, during this whole saga of the protest and the eventual riot, we didn't have a single death casualty. So that is something that really shows whether actually the government forces were that much brutal or not. If they were, you'd have, considering the scale of it, you'd have real casualty in a sense that you'd have people dying, but which we didn't have it. When the protest started, the ruling party itself, we supported the protest. We asked our student wings to go with the protesters because they were school children. The whole country were everyone in the party. We supported the protest, and but what was happening was Dhaka is one of the most clogged up cities in the world. So when these protests were going on, city streets were blocked, and for a couple of days, traffic came to standstill in this city. So which obviously creates a situation where citizens are not very happy because already in a clogged, very heavily trafficked city, you have this situation where a lot of protests were going on, and on top of it, what was happening was that school children were checking driving licenses and car fitness certificates, which a lot of these protesters claimed that was because the police have failed to ensure fitness of cars, public transport, and people's driving skill. So there you had this very innovative, very creative protest, which all of us really wholeheartedly supported.
Okay, so Mahibul, listen, okay, we completely understand about what the students were doing on the streets, but what about the issue of violence? Because police denied that they fired rubber bullets and tear gas at protesters.
This is where I'm coming to. This is where I'm coming to.
Hospital staff say they have treated injuries that concurrent that show that rubber bullets have been used. Consistent is the word I've been looking for. Consistent with the firing of rubber bullets. What about that issue?
Yes, I'm coming into that. So when you have this we had this protest at near the end of this protest, just before the last weekend, BNP, which is one of the main opposition parties in Bangladesh, they instructed their activists to merge with the protesters and come out on the street, because they also have a political agenda to capitalize on these protests. So they have come out in large numbers. Our activists were also out on the street. And then one fine morning, what had happened is that suddenly, in the disguise of school children, a lot of protesters started demonstrating towards our party headquarters in Dhaka, Dhanmondi. And suddenly, out of nowhere, protesters with sticks, stones, and in fact, we've heard gunfires from this demonstration, wearing, in some instances, school uniform, in some instances, not school uniform. Suddenly, they have attacked the party headquarters. And during that time, a riot sort of situation broke out, and police were defending there, and our party activists had to defend our headquarters. At that time, we realized that something is seriously wrong. So what had happened was that in social media, certain quarters have spread this rumor that we are hiding 4 dead bodies in our party headquarters and 5 girls are being repeatedly raped. And this was spread like wildfire. And I was in the party office on the day. In fact, I have heard gunshots fired towards us, not towards the demonstration, and large stones were being hurled out of nowhere. This was totally unexpected.
Mahibul, we have to keep it a little bit more brief.
We've also intercepted conversation of BNP senior leaders who were instructing their activists to get into this protest and basically sabotage.
Okay, let's put that point to Tasneem and just keep it a little bit more brief, because we won't be able to cover everything we need to. Tasneem, what do you make? Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister, saying that a third party... Mahibul, please. The Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, saying that a third party could sabotage the protests, and as Mahibul is saying, the government believes that the protests have been hijacked by other parties who are interested in fomenting unrest in Bangladesh. Is there any evidence of that as far as you've seen, Tasneem?
Well, let me just address something that came up. I'm not going to resort to ad hominem. I'll be very happy to have a philosophical discussion in future about the philosophy of anarchism. I represent the people who are against repression anywhere in the world, against the people, including Bangladesh. And Mr. Chaudhry is representing a government. While he was speaking, we could see that he represents a government that is running uniformed school children over with APCs. So let's be very clear where we stand here. What is happening is this is a government, I say again, which prefers to rule by brute force. He mentions that the students were marching towards the party office. What's wrong with that? There is a party office and it's not in a restricted area. And the general secretary of his party, Obaidul Qadir, on the record, he said, if the students were marching towards our office, what should we have done? Should we have kissed them? This is the kind of rhetoric, this is the kind of language Awami League ministers are using against these school children. And we see, including Sheikh Hasina, including Mr. Chaudhry's party's top leadership, just spouting on conspiracy theories without any proof whatsoever. This was an absolutely beautiful, peaceful protest of school children who came out in thousands, and they simply demanded their right to a normal life, their right to life. And the response has been schizophrenic conspiracy theories and smearing of these children. Mr. Chaudhry has also mentioned Chhatra League, the student wing of his government. I mean, we have seen video evidence where Chhatra League members wearing helmets were shooting at students. We could see the video. It is there. There is evidence, and the whole world has seen that. And again, I'm very tempted to remind your viewers that on the screen, one person is being very economical with the truth, and another person is saying the truth. And your viewers in Bangladesh know.
Okay, Tasneem, Mohibul, you've made your point. Okay, you both disagree about what happened outside those party headquarters.
I was there at the party office.
No, absolutely. Listen, we have you on tape saying that. You both had your say. You disagree about what happened. Okay, let's look at the bigger picture about whether these protests may be symbolic of another problem, a greater holistic problem in Bangladeshi society. What does it say, Mohibul, about the government when a government minister with ties to the powerful transport union, Shah Jahan Khan, questions why there is such an uproar about the death of 2 children in Dhaka when the day before 33 people were killed in a bus crash in India? How is he placing such a minimal value on 2 children?
See, we have a classical situation where one minister was representing the transport workers' unions, and you have this really tragic incident of children dying. So his comment at that time was terribly insensitive. There is no doubt about that, and we do not own that statement. And when he made that statement, apparently, this is his version, he said that he wasn't aware of the accident that had happened in Dhaka. Accidents like this do happen around the country, but this had attracted a lot of media attention because most of the media houses are concentrated in Dhaka, and therefore, of course, the reaction was a lot higher. And Mr. Shah Jahan Khan, the minister who represents the Transport Workers Union, of course, there are discussions and issues regarding conflict of interest matters. It doesn't work the way it works in the West, where as soon as conflict of interest issues are raised, we try to avoid conflict. Bangladesh being any other typical developing country, conflict of interest issues aren't exactly how it works in the West. So there were there were demands that he resigns from either the ministerial post or the workers' union leadership. And it didn't work that way because he refused to resign. But the point was that the point from our party's point of view was that his resignation wouldn't change the structural problem that we have. And we looked into the problem. We were trying to resolve the problem. The students demanded higher punishment for reckless driving. We have now brought in a new law. Even though we have brought in a new law, which will be passed in the national parliament, there remains a structural problem in terms of implementation of the law, in terms of having the drivers with the right skill on the road. There are issues like that, and that have to be dealt with in a sustainable and long-term manner. Riots are not solution to something that is that has long-term, that was there for a long term. And it has to be solved. We're not denying that there is a problem with regards to the road safety.
It's great that you mentioned...
But riots aren't the solution. The way this riot has been portrayed as that they are a wholesale protest against the government's rule, we absolutely disagree with that. That is something that is being played by the ultra-left to the ultra-right. That is how they were playing it.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. We appreciate your time. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, did the United States and Colombia try to assassinate Venezuela's president? And did America's top diplomat lose his job for stopping an invasion of Qatar? Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro has credited the military with stopping an attempt on his life. A government investigation says drones carrying plastic explosives were flown at a rally Maduro was addressing, but they were intercepted in mid-flight. He says the assassination attempt was organized by Colombia's outgoing president, Juan Manuel Santos, and political opponents in the United States. Some people are skeptical of that assessment after a local group claimed responsibility for the attack. Natalie Pahonen reports.
It was meant to be a day of pomp and ceremony in downtown Caracas. But when Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro addressed the nation, the performance went off script. The government says explosives carried by drones were detonated in an attempt to assassinate the president. Maduro escaped unharmed, but 7 National Guards were injured. While police are still investigating what happened on Saturday, the president says everything points to an international right-wing plot to kill him.
Yo quiero que se le explique al gobierno de los Estados Unidos y al gobierno de Colombia. Solicitemos en extradición a todos los responsables que financiaron, dirigieron y llevaron a cabo este atentado terrorista que viven en el estado de la Florida o que viven en territorio de los Estados Unidos y de Colombia.
Maduro has accused former Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos of being involved in the attempt on his life.
For God's sake, to Venezuela's president I say, on Saturday I was doing more important things. I was at my granddaughter's baptism.
An opposition group called the National Movement of Soldiers in T-shirts has claimed responsibility. But in another twist, a former municipal police chief, Salvatore Lucchese, says he helped organize the attack.
This was not a trial run. We will be clear on that. We had an objective, and in the moment we were not able to make it happen 100%, but we will qualify it as a total success.
This rally was held days after the attack as a show of support for Maduro. The president was a no-show. But that didn't seem to matter to these people who wanted to tell the world they remain united behind their leader.
We completely reject any intervention and any damage they want to do to us because Nicolas Maduro is the people.
Venezuela wants peace. Political differences are resolved at the ballot box in elections.
In May, Maduro won another 6 years in office. Less than half of all eligible voters turned out, and opposition groups boycotted the polls. An indication of just how politically divided the country has become and how divisive Maduro's leadership has been. Venezuela has basically become synonymous with economic crisis. The oil-producing nation struggles to feed its people or provide them with medical care. Inflation regularly hits more than 100% a month. The increasing cost of everyday life and crackdowns on political dissent have led to a vocal opposition against the president's rule. Since the attack, Maduro has been keen to show the nation he's still the man in charge. But he looks vulnerable. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. Joining me from Bogota, Colombia, Raul Gallegos, who is an associate director at Control Risks. It's a political risk analysis firm. And in Mérida, Venezuela, Paul Dobson is there. Paul is a journalist working for VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Raul, I have to start with you because you're the skeptic. You don't believe that this was an assassination attempt, do you? Why not?
You know, a lot of observers are skeptics in the sense that, you know, we've heard in the past, both from President Maduro and from President Chavez, that they have been essentially the target of attacks on their lives. And repeatedly, this has happened over a long period of time. However, very little solid evidence has been produced over time. And so I think it's natural that a number of observers overseas and locally tend to take this with a certain grain of salt. That's not to say that there is not an opposition and there aren't very radical people that desire ill to the president, but certainly having seen this recurrently, you know, it's reasonable to expect that a lot of people will express a certain level of skepticism toward this.
Paul, has the Attorney General presented any hard evidence yet, apart from saying that people have been detained, that they know from where the drones were flown? Is there any hard evidence?
Yes, well, last night the president of Venezuela received permission from the Attorney General to publicly disclose some of the evidence which is part of the investigation, which he claimed is very advanced. He spoke to the nation and he disclosed numerous videos, original videos, two of which were confessions from those who have been arrested as part of the operation. There was also a series of audios used, telephone audios used amongst the groups which carried out the bomb attack. And there was a series of other elements, vehicles, munitions, and so on, from those involved, those who have already been arrested, which corroborate both the popular videos that we've seen of the events, no? And also the commentaries from those who have claimed responsibility for this crime.
Yeah, Raul, you talked about the opposition. Who are the known groups who have, because you need both the ability and the desire to carry out an assassination, if that's what this was, but who are these groups that are known to have both of these qualities that would be required?
You know, our position certainly is that based on what we've seen so far from the opposition in Venezuela, it doesn't seem like there is leadership that is strong enough and certainly radical enough to attempt something of this nature or to attempt the assassination of the president. We haven't seen any groups, you know, similar to, you know, actual guerrilla groups the way we've seen in Colombia, the FARC, the ELN. I mean, there's no real established insurgency that we can identify yet. However, on the other hand, we have seen, I think one of the interesting things is the fact that, you know, the Venezuelan government is well known to have a very effective intelligence apparatus, a very effective communications and propaganda apparatus. And I think that when you look at how this has played out and how the government is acting in response, I think a lot of people are expecting essentially the government to use this opportunity to gain increasing control, to establish its control of government, of the institutions, and its influence over the private sector as well, which is what we naturally expected to happen after Maduro essentially managed to become president again.
Paul, what do you make of that? Because, I mean, apart from what seems to be at the moment, before the investigation is complete, apart from what appears to be a knee-jerk reaction from Maduro that Juan Manuel Santos, now the ex-president of Colombia, that Venezuelan opponents living in the United States, the far-right groups in the country are all behind this, the opposition sees almost everything that happens to Maduro and everything that he does as an attempt to stay in power while the country seems to be cracking up around him.
Yeah, well, I think first I'd like to make a comment on something Raul just said. Maduro didn't manage to make himself president again. Maduro was elected in a free and fair popular election, which all of the international observers who were in the country at the time declared was transparent.
Yeah, hold on, Paul, listen, it may have been free and fair, it may have been transparent, but you know, the whole world that follows Venezuela knows that most of the opposition weren't even standing because they're either in prison, they're in exile, or they were barred from office. So, sure, he won the election, but it wasn't totally above board in terms of who his competitors were. So, fine, he was elected, but let's look at what's happening now as he's the president again.
At the moment, he has pointed the finger to a right-wing deputy called Juan Requences, who was arrested last night, who was named by one of the suspects involved in, one of the accused involved in this assassination attempt directly. They're currently questioning this member of parliament. And there's a few other names which have been publicly knocked around by, again, those accused of being involved in this criminal activity. This isn't the first time we've seen the Venezuelan opposition take violent means to try to assume power. The group which has claimed responsibility for this attack, which is a small group of right-wing activists called Soldiers in T-shirts, have publicly said that the objective is to call people onto the streets for the taking of power. Last night, President Maduro, in his address to the nation, said that it's one thing to have a debate of ideas with argument, it's another thing to use violent methods to take power. I remind your viewers that in 2014 and in 2017, the Venezuelan opposition, the right-wing extremists, led violent actions against the government, which included bombing or attempts to bombing public institutions, primary schools, public transport networks, barricades set up in the streets. And there were numerous deaths caused by these actions. And the objective of these actions was to overthrow a democratically elected government.
This is to both of you, but Paul, let's start with you. What might the death of Nicolas Maduro achieve? Would it even end the socialist program of the Venezuelan leadership?
The Venezuelan constitution says that in the case of an absolute void of power, which of course the death of a president would invoke, the vice president will assume power until new elections will be held, which will be in I think, 3 or 6 months' time. So this is the constitution, what would happen. Whether the opposition, the right-wing forces, who, as we've seen, as I just explained, don't necessarily believe in the constitutional methods to assume power, whether they would respect these or whether they would then try to install a coup d'etat, as they did in 2002, is up to them. But the ethos, at least last year when we saw this big uprising against the government by the right-wing extremists, the ethos from across the board in Venezuela, from the average people on the street, was the necessity to impose an ethos of peace, an ethos of debate and discussion, and that's the way in which we should resolve issues, not through bombing, not through violence. And this is a message which was reiterated by the president last night.
Raul, do you think the country might change direction if Maduro were to die before his term were to be up? Let's say that assassination attempt was successful. What would happen in Venezuela? What's your reading of that?
Based on what we're seeing right now, if we're completely honest, regarding the forces on the ground, what we're seeing is a very demoralized, broken, and divided opposition that doesn't really have. Well, first of all, the leading figures are either in jail or either disqualified from running for office. So it's very unlikely that you will have an opposition that would stand ready to take over government, if you will, or have the opportunity to even reach that point. I think the more likely situation would be if, and based on the Constitution as it's currently being read by this government, what we would have is that the president would no longer be there, and then you would probably have a number of groups within Chavismo that would rise to the occasion. Delcy Rodriguez is vice president. That means that her and her brother, which are very strong players, would be in a very good position to take over power. You also have Diosdado Cabello, who's the second most powerful man in government right now by running the Constitutional Assembly. I think it's important to note that the Constitutional Assembly has the power to actually take over and sideline the president if it chose to do so. So there are a number of groups within Chavismo that could stand in a good position to succeed Maduro if that came to pass, if you will. However, we do see a successful coup as a very unlikely situation right now, given how strongly Maduro and his collaborators have managed to retain control of pretty much all the levers of power and have a very strong alliance still within the military, despite talk of the fact that there is discontent within the military, which is normal. I mean, there is discontent within the larger population. But from discontent to an actual successful ability to remove the president forcefully, I think that's another matter.
Paul, you're on the ground there. Is there any way to gauge the popularity of Nicolas Maduro? Is the press free in Venezuela? Are there any credible opinion polls that show what especially this may have done to the feeling of the people towards him, what happened on Saturday at that rally?
Well, obviously, it's too early to have opinion polls and so on conducted after the events of Saturday. The general feeling here on the ground, speaking to people, I work as an independent journalist here, the general feeling on the ground is that in those who supported Maduro, who historically supported the Bolivarian process here, it has stirred a patriotic feeling, and there's a certain amount of rallying of the troops behind Maduro. There is also a middle sector of the population, which the neither nor sector, who neither feel strongly for the opposition or the government, but who are expressing very clearly that maybe while they don't necessarily agree with the policies of Maduro, they are definitely against the methods used by those who attempted to kill him. And the return to violence is something that they will vehemently reject. There is also a very, very minor sector of the population, the right-wing extremists, who basically believe that any method is valid as long as it gets rid of the president. And these are people, you have seen commentaries here in Venezuela on the social networking especially, who say, you know, what a shame this attempt failed. So these are sort of pro-violent opinions, which is, I stress, a small minority of the population. The vast majority of the population condemns the method used, regardless of their opinion of Maduro and his policies. The latest opinion polls, if you like, we have on Maduro's popularity would be the most recent election, which was May 20th, with a low turnout compared to Venezuelan standards, but a high turnout compared to most other countries, including European countries, in which he ran against two opposition candidates and one other Chavista candidate, and he won a very significant majority. So this is the latest figure which we can use to judge his popularity. But obviously, like I say, the effect of the bombing attack on Saturday is too early to tell.
You know, we've been talking about political philosophies and the antagonism that the Maduro government is creating amongst its opponents, Raul. But then when you look at everyday life in Venezuela, and of course it's widely reported almost weekly about these huge inflation rates that some project by the end of the year will be 14,000% for the year 2018. Would the divisiveness being felt in society be suppressed greatly if people weren't suffering so much in their daily lives? And then, therefore, there comes the question, how much is Maduro to blame for the economic meltdown of the country, which no one can deny? Even he, the president, doesn't deny it.
Yes, I think what's undeniable is that the current crisis stems in large part from a number of policies that have created distortions in the economy. I think that's undeniable unless we don't believe in incentives. If we believe in incentives, we know that, you know, companies cannot produce goods below cost because no one produces at a loss. Companies cannot produce goods if they don't have access to foreign currency to import raw material and finished products. Companies won't invest if they feel that their assets are going to be seized and their employees are going to be arrested. if they are accused of, sabotaging the economy for not producing enough, even though they lose money doing so. There is something to economic logic. There is something to incentives, and that's just human nature. And so I think that a number of these policies, capital controls, price controls, nationalizations maintained over time have led to what we're seeing today, coupled with obviously oil prices declining. I mean, it's undeniable.
Raul Gallegos, Paul Dobson, thank you very much. The investigative website The Intercept is reporting that Saudi Arabia, backed by the UAE, had plans to invade Qatar. The article says the only reason the invasion didn't happen last year was because of Rex Tillerson, who at the time was the US Secretary of State. The Intercept reports Tillerson heard about the plans from Qatari intelligence and that his pressure on the Saudis and Emiratis incensed them so much that it may have cost him his job. In March, the US President Donald Trump fired Tillerson on Twitter 1 week before the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman arrived at the White House. To discuss this, I'm joined now from Doha by the former FBI agent Martin Reardon. He is now a senior director of the Qatar International Academy for Security Studies. In Riyadh is Salman al-Ansari. He is the founder of the Washington-based Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Same question to both of you, starting with Salman. What do you make of this story that Rex Tillerson put pressure on Riyadh and the UAE not to invade Qatar?
Yeah, thank you, Adnan, and hi to your honorable guest, Mr. Martin. And basically, when it comes to this theme, I think it has been talked a lot about it with a lot of allegations and speculations in different media reports. But we need to look at basically the facts. The facts cannot be traced until we know the history of these countries. The history of these countries have nothing to do with involving themselves into direct wars with other countries without having a legitimate cause or legitimate kind of demand, just like what happened in Yemen, or just like what happened when the King of Bahrain asked Saudi Arabia and the GCC to come and support them. So I don't see this to be very factual. I don't see it to be very accurate because, like, we have seen all the reports that talked about why Tillerson has been fired. Like, there are 4 major scenarios. One, like in the US media, they talk about that Tillerson wants to hit the North Korea negotiation, which Trump did not want. But this is still a media report. Yes, it is backed by anonymous officials, etc., just like what happened with the Intercept report. But also, if you look at the Intercept report, it says it clearly that the major or the beginning of this talk about Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates to invade Qatar has happened and started from the Qataris themselves. So the Intercept report says it clearly that the whole story started from the narrative of the Qataris. So I don't know if they convinced some media platforms in the West or in the US. Maybe this is something interesting. And the other thing is people speak about Tillerson differences with Trump. You know, like the things about like what happened in the media when they say Tillerson insulted Trump in closed doors when he called him like a moron or something like that in the media. So people also speak about this as a possible scenario. The other thing is about the conflict of interest, because people sometimes think in the US, maybe the White House itself as well, that Rex Tillerson was acting on behalf with ExxonMobil's kind of interest rather than the U.S. interest. I'm not here to confirm this or that, but all what I'm trying to say is Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, I think they had no intention at all whatsoever to intervene or to have a military kind of intervention in Qatar, because it's not needed at all. We can actually make Qatar to be going on the right path and stop supporting terrorism by the means that we are using right now.
Okay, 2 separate issues to start with, Martin. Rex Tillerson being dismissed, that's a fact. And then Salman says we won't know the facts about any potential invasion as well, because we're talking about that until more details come out. Surely we will only ever know that if someone from the UAE or from Saudi Arabia admits that there was a potential plan. How do you see those 2 separate issues? And then, of course, they are conjoined.
Well, I think as far as the a planned invasion by the Saudis and the Emiratis into Qatar, in all likelihood, it was discussed. Geopolitical conflicts like this, when there's a number of options that are looked at. What can you do diplomatically? What can you do with information warfare? What can you do with economic sanctions? What can you do with military options? But I think both countries, they're rational leaders, and they would have decided fairly early on that it's not worth the risk. For the Saudis and the Emiratis to invade a much smaller country, Qatar, would have been looked at, particularly in the article where it said for economic reasons, they would have been international pariahs. It'd be similar to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. So it may have been put on as an option. These are often done that way, but no serious consideration given to it. On your second point, you know, could his interest in this or cooling things caused friction with the administration and eventually led to his downfall? Again, as Salman said, there were at least a dozen major incidents between or disagreements between Secretary Tillerson and President Trump. This was the first major disagreement, but then every month up until the time he was fired, it continued, and a number of the major ones Salman mentioned. The day before Secretary Tillerson was fired, that was when he disagreed with the president, or he took the side of Prime Minister Theresa May in saying that, you know, this investigation, the fact that it was nerve agents that the Russians were known to have produced and that they were involved, that upset the White House, and within 24 hours he was gone.
Okay, Salman, UK intelligence and US intelligence says there was a plan by Saudi Arabia, backed by the UAE, to invade in the summer of 2017, to invade Qatar. On 20th of June, the State Department said Tillerson had more than 20 telephone calls and meetings with Gulf and other regional and intermediate actors, including 3 phone calls and 2 meetings with the Saudi foreign minister. Can we at least presume, would you be able to analyze whether Saudi Arabia would be upset at Rex Tillerson or any US Secretary of State trying to mediate between the Gulf nations that are having a dispute, Qatar on the one side and then Saudi Arabia and 3 other countries on the other side? Would they be upset at just the Americans being involved with what they might consider to be a regional and domestic matter?
Yeah. Thank you, Adnan. I think I'm going to speak on my capacity as a Saudi citizen and analyst of political affairs. And I think, yes, indeed, that Tillerson, I kind of feel that the region, specifically Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, I feel that they do not have huge kind of chemistry with Tillerson. But does that mean that we wanted him out, or we pushed for him to be out? I think this is too much to believe, you know, and it's like an accumulated kind of things. It's a lot of things that built up in the White House, I think, that made the president to fire Mr. Tillerson. I don't see it to be having anything to do with a possible kind of invasion, because this is more of it's just not factual. It's not even logic.
Martin, if we suppose that the relationship over the past 50 or 60 years between Washington and Riyadh has been based largely on Americans buying Saudi oil, and now the United States being largely energy independent, can you give us an analysis of where the future relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia is going?
No, I don't think oil is going to play. I mean, the United States, it's been a number of decades since Saudi Arabia was a major supplier of oil. The United States' interest in oil in the Gulf, not so much as a supplier, but to ensure the free movement of oil, just because of the impact that any restriction would have on the global economy. But I think if you look back over the last, well, we'll go back over 50 or 60 years, Saudi Arabia and the United States have had a very close relationship. And I think the Saudis, during the second 4 years, the second term of the Obama administration, felt that they were pushed off a little bit. This is when the Obama administration was pushing hard for the Iran deal, despite despite Saudi pushback against that, but the Obama administration went through with this. And then throughout the campaign in 2016, then candidate Trump was not in favor of the Iran deal. He wanted it pulled out and done away with. And I think the Saudis saw this as a potential ally back in the White House that they can work with. So there was a lot of effort by both the Saudis and the Emiratis to restore that relationship with the United States. For Iran primarily, and then I think when the blockade started in June 2017, they thought they would have more support just based on the summit that occurred in Saudi Arabia just weeks before. But there's an interest there in keeping those relations strong. And I think as far as Secretary Tillerson, the Saudis and the Emiratis were no doubt very upset with his efforts to quiet things with the blockade, to get the sides to talk. And remember, Secretary Tillerson came out publicly and said, where's the complaint here? You don't even have any demands. You haven't said what's bothering you. And then within a matter of a few days, the list of 10 demands came out publicly, what the Saudis, what the quartet wanted. But I think they both looked at Secretary Tillerson as a potential threat to their relationship with the administration. One, because of his stance with Qatar, trying to mediate, but also Secretary Tillerson was very pro-Iran deal. He did not want the president to pull out of that, and that is something he campaigned on, and he had to do to satisfy his base. So, yes, the Saudis and Emiratis looked at him as a threat. Was that the reason he was fired? That was one of several things. And again, Salman mentioned a few, and then it went right up until the day before with the nerve agent attack in the UK. President Trump, and they've been rumored about this since November, for 5 months before. President Trump had enough. He fired him.
Salman, we are running out of time. We are out of time. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on The Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Adnan Nawaz. But do check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, separated at sea. When refugees are rescued, some family members are ending up on opposite shores of the Mediterranean. What can be done to reunite parents with their missing children? Until then, thanks for watching and goodbye.